What if I told you that God may have deliberately chosen a king he knew would fail? What if the entire story of King Saul wasn't about finding the perfect ruler, but about orchestrating the most elaborate divine lesson in human history? The evidence is hidden in plain sight, scattered throughout the biblical narrative like breadcrumbs, leading to a disturbing conclusion that most scholars dare not voice aloud. The story begins not with Saul's coronation, but with Israel's ultimate act of rebellion. In 1 Samuel 8, the people demanded a king, like all the other nations. But this wasn't just political reform, it was spiritual mutiny. Samuel warned them that their king would take their sons for his armies, their daughters for his service, their best fields for his officials, and 1/10 of their grain and flocks. The people didn't care. They wanted to be normal. Here's where it gets chilling. God told Samuel, "Listen to them and give them a king." But was this permission or punishment? The Hebrew word used suggests not merely allowing, but actively facilitating their desire. God wasn't just letting them have their way. He was giving them exactly what they thought they wanted, knowing it would destroy them. Enter Saul, son of Kish, searching for his father's lost donkeys. What appears to be a chance encounter with the prophet Samuel was anything but random. Samuel had been told the day before that God would send him a man from the land of Benjamin to anoint as king. But examine the details closely, and disturbing patterns emerge. Saul was chosen for his physical appearance. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. In ancient Near Eastern culture, height was associated with divine favor and military prowess. He looked like what the people expected a king to look like. But God had already established through Samuel's own anointing that the Lord looks at the heart, not the outward appearance. So why choose based on exactly what God claims not to value? The answer is terrifying, because God was giving the people precisely what they deserved, a king who embodied their shallow, worldly values. When Samuel anoints Saul privately, he provides 3 specific signs to confirm God's choice. But these signs reveal a troubling pattern. The first involves meeting men carrying bread, wine, and goats, symbols of sustenance, celebration, and sacrifice. The second involves encountering a garrison of Philistines, Israel's enemies. The third involves Saul prophesying with a group of prophets, temporarily receiving God's Spirit. Notice the progression: provision, conflict, and spiritual power. This wasn't just confirmation. It was a preview of Saul's entire reign. He would have material blessings, face constant warfare, and experience intermittent spiritual highs. But there's something more sinister here. The Spirit of God came upon Saul temporarily, not permanently. Unlike David, who was anointed and immediately received the Spirit permanently, Saul's spiritual empowerment was conditional and fleeting. Was God setting up a king destined to lose divine favor? From the moment Saul becomes king, he faces a series of tests that seem designed for failure. His first major challenge comes when the Ammonites threaten Jabesh-Gilead. Saul responds with righteous anger, rallies Israel, and achieves a crushing victory. Success, right? But this victory only sets him up for greater expectations and more impossible choices. Then comes the Philistine crisis at Michmash. Samuel tells Saul to wait 7 days for him to arrive and offer sacrifices before battle. But Samuel delays, the people scatter in fear, and Saul faces an agonizing choice. Follow the letter of Samuel's command and watch his army dissolve, or take action to preserve his kingdom. He chooses to offer the sacrifice himself. Samuel arrives immediately after, almost as if he was waiting nearby, watching to see what Saul would do. "You have acted foolishly," Samuel declares. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you." But was this command reasonable? Saul was facing military catastrophe, his people were fleeing, and his prophet was nowhere to be found. Any reasonable leader would have acted exactly as Saul did. This pattern repeats throughout Saul's reign. Impossible situations, delayed guidance, and immediate condemnation when he makes pragmatic decisions. The most controversial example comes with the Amalekite campaign. God commands Saul to totally destroy the Amalekites. Men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Saul obeys, but spares King Agag and the best livestock, claiming he intended to sacrifice them to God. Samuel's response is swift and brutal. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. But consider the moral complexity here. Saul showed mercy to a defeated enemy and preserved valuable resources for religious purposes. In any other context, these would be virtuous actions. Yet they became the final nail in his coffin. Was Saul being tested for obedience, or was he being trapped by an impossible moral choice? Some scholars argue that the Amalekite command was itself a test, that God was looking for a king who would refuse to commit genocide, even under divine command. If so, Saul failed by obeying too much, not too little. Perhaps most disturbing is what happens after God's rejection. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord torments him. This isn't metaphorical language. The text presents this as literal divine punishment. God doesn't just abandon Saul. He actively sends psychological torment. The young David, already secretly anointed as the next king, is brought to play music that soothes Saul's anguish. The irony is deliberate and cruel. The man who will replace Saul is the only one who can provide him comfort. Every time David plays, Saul is reminded, consciously or unconsciously, of his own inadequacy and coming replacement. When you examine Saul's story from beginning to end, a disturbing picture emerges. Every major decision point in his reign seems designed to expose his human limitations rather than utilize his strengths. He's given commands that require superhuman discernment, placed in situations where all options lead to failure, and then condemned for making the choices any reasonable person would make. The most chilling possibility is that Saul was never meant to succeed. He was a living object lesson, a demonstration to Israel of why they shouldn't have demanded a king in the first place. His failure wasn't a bug in God's plan, it was a feature. Consider the evidence. A king chosen for superficial qualities, given impossible commands, subjected to delayed guidance, condemned for reasonable decisions, and ultimately tormented with divinely sent madness. If this was a test, it was rigged from the beginning. Consider the evidence. A king chosen for superficial qualities, given impossible commands, subjected to delayed guidance, condemned for reasonable decisions, and ultimately tormented with divinely sent madness. If this was a test, it was rigged from the beginning. This raises profound questions about divine justice and human agency. If God knew Saul would fail, was his punishment just? If the tests were designed to be impossible, was Saul ever truly free to choose differently? The traditional interpretation paints Saul as a cautionary tale about disobedience and pride. But a closer examination suggests something far more troubling. A divine setup designed to teach Israel the cost of rejecting God's original plan. The most haunting aspect of Saul's story isn't his failure. It's the possibility that he never had a chance to succeed. He was chosen not for his potential for greatness, but for his potential for spectacular, instructive failure. His reign wasn't about establishing a kingdom. It was about demonstrating why kingdoms are dangerous when they replace divine rule. If this interpretation is correct, then Saul wasn't Israel's first king. He was their first and most elaborate divine object lesson, a man sacrificed on the altar of theological instruction. The question that haunts his story isn't whether he deserved his fate, but whether anyone could have done better under the same impossible circumstances. On his last night alive, Israel's king committed the ultimate blasphemy, and what happened next will shock you. The story of Saul's consultation with the Witch of Endor isn't just a desperate king's final gambit. It's a conspiracy that exposes the darkest spiritual underbelly of ancient Israel and raises terrifying questions about what forces were truly at work in the shadows of the kingdom. The setup is almost too perfect to be coincidental. Saul, facing his final battle against the Philistines, finds himself spiritually abandoned. The text makes this clear. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. God has gone silent. Samuel is dead. The king who once received direct divine guidance now faces complete spiritual isolation at the moment he needs help most. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. Despite having issued royal decrees banning mediums and spiritists from Israel, commands that carried the death penalty, Saul somehow knows exactly where to find a practicing witch. His servants don't hesitate when he asks for a medium. they immediately direct him to Endor. This wasn't a desperate search through underground networks. This was insider knowledge. The implications are staggering. Either Saul's administration was so corrupt that his own servants maintained contacts with the occult practitioners he had supposedly eliminated, or the persecution of witches was a sham designed to drive the practice underground while keeping it accessible to those in power. The king who publicly crushed witchcraft privately relied on it. The journey to Endor itself reveals the conspiracy's depth. Saul disguises himself and travels by night with 2 companions. But consider the logistics. Endor was in Philistine-controlled territory. For the king of Israel to travel there during wartime required either incredible recklessness or inside assistance. Someone was ensuring safe passage for this forbidden mission. When Saul arrives at the witch's dwelling, her initial reaction is telling. She's immediately suspicious, fearing it's a trap to expose her illegal practices. But she's not afraid of random soldiers. She's specifically afraid of being entrapped by Saul, who cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. This suggests Saul's purge was recent, brutal, and personally associated with the king himself. Yet here he was, seeking the very services he had violently suppressed. The witch's terror reveals another disturbing truth. The occult community knew exactly what Saul looked like. Despite his disguise, she recognizes him the moment Samuel's spirit appears. This wasn't her first encounter with the royal court. The underground network of forbidden spiritual practices had deep connections to the palace itself. But the most controversial aspect of this story is what actually happened when the séance began. The text describes the witch's shock when Samuel actually appears, suggesting she was as surprised as anyone that real supernatural contact occurred. Most mediums in the ancient world were frauds, using cold reading and psychological manipulation to deceive clients. This witch expected to perform her usual tricks. Instead, she got genuine necromancy. The appearance of Samuel raises questions that have haunted theologians for millennia. Was this really the prophet's spirit, or was it a demonic deception? The text seems to support the former. Samuel delivers accurate prophecies and speaks with his characteristic authority. But if God had cut off all communication with Saul, why would he allow the dead prophet to break through via forbidden necromancy? Some scholars propose a chilling alternative. What appeared wasn't Samuel's spirit responding to the witch's power, but God himself using the forbidden ritual to deliver Saul's final judgment. The Samuel that appears doesn't comfort or advise. He condemns. His message is brutal. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. A death sentence delivered through the very occult practices Saul had outlawed. This interpretation suggests that God commandeered the witch's ritual, turning Saul's act of spiritual rebellion into the vehicle for divine justice. The king sought forbidden knowledge and received it, along with his doom. The irony is perfect and terrifying. Saul's final communication with the divine realm came through the exact practices he had forbidden his people. But the conspiracy goes deeper. Why did Saul turn to necromancy in his final crisis? The answer lies in understanding what the Urim and Thummim actually were, the divine lots used by priests to discern God's will. These weren't just religious artifacts. They were Israel's primary intelligence gathering system, their equivalent to modern military reconnaissance. When God stopped answering through the Urim, Saul lost his strategic advantage. Desperate for intelligence about Philistine plans and divine intentions, Saul turned to the enemy's methods. If God wouldn't speak through approved channels, perhaps the dead would speak through forbidden ones. This wasn't just spiritual rebellion, it was military espionage using occult means. The Witch of Endor wasn't just a local fortune teller. She was effectively a foreign intelligence asset. Her ability to contact the dead made her a valuable resource for gathering information unavailable through conventional means. Saul's consultation was essentially a defection to enemy spiritual technology. Consider the timing. Saul seeks occult guidance the night before his final battle, learns of his coming death, yet still leads his army into combat the next morning. This wasn't suicide. It was a king choosing to fulfill his role even knowing it would destroy him. The forbidden knowledge didn't save him. It revealed the futility of his situation while demanding he face it anyway. Consider the timing. Saul seeks occult guidance the night before his final battle, learns of his coming death, yet still leads his army into combat the next morning. This wasn't suicide. It was a king choosing to fulfill his role even knowing it would destroy him. The forbidden knowledge didn't save him. It revealed the futility of his situation while demanding he face it anyway. The aftermath of the séance reveals another layer of the conspiracy. The witch, who moments before was terrified of royal retribution, suddenly becomes Saul's caretaker. She prepares a meal for the condemned king, showing him hospitality in his final hours. This transformation suggests she understood exactly what had transpired, that she had facilitated not just divination, but divine judgment. The broader implications are staggering. If Saul's persecution of mediums was incomplete enough that he could easily locate and access them, what does this say about the spiritual state of his kingdom? How many other forbidden practices were thriving in the shadows while being publicly condemned? The Witch of Endor wasn't an isolated practitioner. She was part of a network that had survived royal persecution and maintained operations in enemy territory. Most disturbing is the possibility that Saul's consultation wasn't his first encounter with forbidden spiritual practices. His knowledge of where to find a medium, his servants' ready assistance, and the witch's eventual recognition all suggest this was a relationship with deeper roots. Perhaps the king who publicly crushed witchcraft had privately been consulting it all along. The story of the Witch of Endor exposes the hypocrisy, desperation, and spiritual corruption that characterized Saul's final days. But it also reveals something more sinister. A shadow network of forbidden spiritual practices that operated parallel to official religion, accessible to those with power and connections, and capable of delivering real supernatural results through illegitimate means. Saul's final act wasn't just personal rebellion. It was a window into the occult infrastructure that existed beneath the surface of ancient Israel, waiting to serve those desperate enough to pay its price. Saul's single act of mercy toward an enemy king triggered a bloodline curse that would haunt Israel for generations. What most people don't realize is that when Saul spared King Agag of the Amalekites, he wasn't just disobeying a divine command. He was unleashing an ancient enemy who would later try to exterminate the Jewish people entirely. The threads of this conspiracy stretch across centuries, connecting Saul's moment of apparent compassion to history's most notorious attempt at genocide. The command to destroy the Amalekites wasn't arbitrary divine brutality. It was a cosmic death warrant with roots stretching back to the Exodus. When Israel first left Egypt, the Amalekites attacked them at Rephidim, targeting the weak, elderly, and stragglers at the rear of the column. This wasn't warfare. It was predatory slaughter of the most vulnerable. God's response was absolute. I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. But Saul's mercy had consequences that wouldn't become apparent for nearly 5 centuries. When he spared King Agag, he preserved not just a life, but a bloodline that carried within it an existential hatred for the Jewish people. The text is careful to note that Samuel personally executed Agag, but this execution came after a crucial delay. Time enough for the condemned king to father descendants who would inherit both his royal bloodline and his people's ancient grudge against Israel. The conspiracy unfolds in the book of Esther, where we encounter Haman the Agagite, a direct descendant of the king Saul had spared. The text deliberately identifies Haman's lineage to make the connection unmistakable. This wasn't coincidence. It was the fulfillment of a curse that had been gestating for centuries. Saul's moment of mercy had preserved the seed of Israel's future destruction. Haman's rise to power in the Persian Empire wasn't just political ambition. It was the culmination of generational hatred finally acquiring the means for ultimate revenge. When Mordecai the Jew refused to bow to Haman, it triggered something deeper than wounded pride. It awakened ancestral fury that had been passed down through Agagite bloodlines for 500 years. The edict Haman convinced King Xerxes to issue wasn't merely ethnic persecution. It was attempted genocide designed to fulfill what the Amalekites had failed to accomplish at Rephidim. The decree called for the complete destruction of all Jews throughout the Persian Empire in a single day: men, women, children, and infants. The language deliberately echoed God's original command regarding the Amalekites, but inverted. Instead of Amalek being blotted out from under heaven, it would be Israel. The date chosen for this destruction reveals another layer of the conspiracy. Haman cast lots to determine the timing, but the result, the 13th day of Adar, wasn't random. This was the same month when Saul had received his command to destroy the Amalekites. The cosmic symmetry was perfect. The month that should have witnessed Amalek's final destruction would instead see Israel's annihilation. But the most chilling aspect of this generational curse is how it exposed the ongoing consequences of incomplete obedience. Saul's mercy toward Agag seemed compassionate in the moment, but it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of spiritual warfare. Some battles aren't just political or military. They're cosmic confrontations between forces that cannot coexist. By preserving Agag, Saul chose temporal mercy over eternal justice. The irony is that Saul's merciful disobedience nearly accomplished what the Amalekites could never achieve through direct warfare. Where military conquest had failed, political manipulation through Agagite descendants nearly succeeded. Haman's plot came closer to destroying the Jewish people than any military campaign in their history. The pattern reveals a disturbing truth about generational consequences. Evil preserved doesn't diminish over time. It concentrates, gathering strength and waiting for the right moment to strike. The hatred that drove the Amalekites to attack vulnerable refugees at Rephidim was still burning in Haman's heart 5 centuries later, now backed by imperial power instead of tribal warfare. Consider the mathematical precision of this curse. Saul spared one man, and that act of mercy nearly resulted in the deaths of millions. The bloodline he preserved produced descendants who would systematically plan the genocide of every Jewish person in the known world. The mercy shown to one enemy king translated into a death sentence for an entire people. The Book of Esther reveals how this ancient curse continued to operate through seemingly natural political processes. Haman didn't need supernatural powers to nearly destroy Israel. He used bureaucracy, royal decrees, and administrative efficiency. The most terrifying curses don't require obvious supernatural intervention. They work through human institutions and natural consequences. But the story also reveals how divine providence operates to counter generational curses. Esther's placement in the Persian court wasn't coincidence. It was strategic positioning to counter the threat that Saul's disobedience had unleashed. Mordecai's adoption of Esther, her selection as queen, and her courage in approaching the king uninvited all combined to create the exact circumstances needed to thwart Haman's plot. The reversal in the Book of Esther is complete and devastating. Haman, who had prepared gallows for Mordecai, is himself hanged on those same gallows. His 10 sons are also executed, ensuring that the Agagite bloodline that had survived Saul's mercy finally faces the extinction it had escaped centuries earlier. The very destruction Haman had planned for the Jews befalls his own family line. But the blood curse reveals something even more disturbing about the nature of divine justice. God's commands aren't just moral guidelines, they're strategic interventions in cosmic warfare. When Saul was commanded to destroy the Amalekites completely, he wasn't being asked to commit arbitrary genocide. He was being asked to prevent future genocide. The mercy that seemed virtuous in the moment was actually cruelty toward future generations. This raises profound questions about the nature of obedience and the long-term consequences of moral compromise. Saul's decision to spare Agag seemed reasonable, even compassionate. He preserved the best livestock for sacrifice and showed mercy to a defeated enemy. These actions align with conventional morality, yet they unleashed centuries of suffering. The pattern suggests that some enemies cannot be reformed, only eliminated. The Amalekite hatred for Israel wasn't political disagreement that could be negotiated away. It was existential opposition that would persist across generations until one side was completely destroyed. Saul's failure to recognize this truth nearly cost his people their existence. The generational nature of this curse also reveals how incomplete obedience creates ongoing vulnerability. By partially obeying God's command, destroying the people but sparing the king, Saul left a door open for future attack. The very thing he preserved out of mercy became the weapon that would later threaten everything he sought to protect. The blood curse that flowed from Saul's disobedience demonstrates that in spiritual warfare, there are no small compromises. Every act of incomplete obedience creates openings for future assault. Every enemy spared out of misguided mercy may return with greater power and deeper hatred. The king who seemed to show extraordinary compassion actually unleashed extraordinary cruelty upon future generations. The story of Haman represents the ultimate fruition of Saul's merciful rebellion, a demonstration that some acts of disobedience echo across centuries, gathering strength and waiting for the perfect moment to exact their revenge.